There's a time that tends to arrive quietly for a lot of people after 50, and it doesn't usually come with a dramatic diagnosis or a single aha moment. It shows up as confusion. You're doing what you've always done, you're eating less, paying attention, maybe even tightening things up more than you used to. And instead of feeling lighter, leaner, or more in control, you feel more tired, more frustrated, and sometimes more defeated than ever. That moment is often followed by a deeply unsettling question that people don't always say out loud, which is, why isn't this working anymore? Not why isn't this working perfectly, but why isn't it working at all? For most of our adult life, fat loss followed a predictable script. You adjusted your intake, increased your effort, maybe pushed a little harder, and your body responded. The relationship between effort and outcome felt mostly linear. If you wanted change, you created a deficit, tightened the reins, and results followed. That experience becomes embedded. It becomes proof. It becomes identity. You internalize the idea that if something stops working, the answer must be more discipline, more control, or more restriction. So when fat loss after 50 stops responding the way that it used to, the instinct is not to question the strategy. The instinct is to question yourself. Now, this is where so many people go wrong, and it's not because they lack willpower or intelligence. It's because no one ever tells us that the body we are working with now is not the same system that responded earlier in our 30s or even in our 40s. The rules didn't just shift slightly, the entire context changed. Stress tolerance changed, recovery capacity changed, muscle responsiveness changed. And yet, the strategy most people reach for is still the same one that they've been using for decades. Eat less, push harder, try again. When that fails, the conclusion is often that something is broken. Nothing is broken, but something is very different. What makes this especially frustrating is that the changes aren't obvious on the surface. You still recognize yourself, you still feel capable, you still know how to be consistent. So when your body doesn't cooperate, it can feel almost personal, as if it's betraying you. That emotional layer matters because it's the reason so many people double down on the strategies that are effectively working against them. When fat loss becomes harder, restriction feels like the responsible response. Doing less feels dangerous. Eating more feels reckless. Rest feels like giving up. And yet, for this stage of life, those instincts are often exactly backwards. This is why fat loss after 50 requires a completely different strategy. Not because you've lost your edge, but because your body is no longer optimized to respond to force. It's optimized to respond to signals. Signals of safety, signals of nourishment, signals of recovery. When those signals are missing, the body doesn't burn fat more efficiently in response to restriction. It protects itself. It slows down. It prioritizes survival over aesthetics. And the more you try to override that with discipline alone, the more resistance you tend to meet. This is the part that no one prepares us for. You were told that calories are the ultimate lever. You were told that if it worked before, it should work again. So when it doesn't, the frustration isn't just physical, it's psychological. You start to feel disconnected from your body. You stop trusting your signals. You start viewing hunger, fatigue, and resistance as enemies instead of information. And once that relationship fractures, fat loss becomes a fight instead of a collaboration. Once you understand that struggle isn't personal failure, the next question naturally becomes, what actually changed? This is where a lot of conversations go off the rails because midlife psychology is often explained in extremes. Either it's framed as catastrophic, like everything is downhill from here, or it's minimized as if nothing meaningful has shifted and you just need to try harder. The truth sits in the middle, and it's far more useful than either extreme. The body after 50 is not broken, but it is operating under a different set of priorities than it once did. Earlier in life, our system was remarkably tolerant. You could underfuel, overexercise, sleep poorly, juggle stress, and still see results. The body had enough hormonal flexibility and recovery capacity to compensate. It could absorb inconsistency and still respond to calorie reduction with fat loss. That adaptability is what many people mistake for proof that restriction works universally. What they don't realize is that adaptability is a resource, and like any resource, it isn't infinite. As we move through midlife, the body becomes more conservative with that adaptability. Stress hormones play a much larger role in decision making. Muscle tissue becomes much more metabolically important and more sensitive to underfueling. Recovery takes longer. Sleep disruption has a greater downstream impact. None of this happens overnight, which is why it's so confusing. You don't wake up one day and feel fundamentally different. Instead, you notice that the same inputs no longer produce the same outputs. You notice that fatigue lingers, hunger feels sharper, motivation wobbles, fat loss slows or stalls even though effort hasn't changed. This is where calories begin to function differently, not because they suddenly don't matter, but because the body is no longer evaluating them in isolation. Calories are interpreted through the lens of stress, safety, and available resources. When intake drops in a system that already feels strained, the body doesn't respond by letting go of stored energy, i.e., fat on our body. It responds by tightening the brakes. It reduces input. It increases efficiency. It becomes protective. From the outside, it looks like stubborn weight. From the inside, it's a survival response. What's important to understand is that this response is not irrational. It's not your body being difficult or uncooperative. It's your body doing exactly what it's designed to do when the signals suggest scarcity combined with stress. After 50, those signals carry more weight. A calorie deficit layered on top of poor sleep, emotional load, inflammation, or inadequate recovery sends a very different message than the same deficit did 20 years ago. The message is no longer we're optimizing, it's we're under threat. This is why simply lowering intake often creates a cascade of unintended consequences at this stage of our lives. Energy drops, which reduces spontaneous movement. Cravings intensify, which increase mental preoccupation with food. Sleep quality worsens, which amplifies stress signaling. Muscle preservation becomes harder, which further lowers metabolic demand. None of this happens because you did something wrong. It happens because the system is responding to the information it's being given. The mistake most people make is assuming that because calories once acted like a simple lever, they should function that way now. But after 50, calories are no longer just fuel. They are information. They tell your body whether it's safe to release stored energy or whether it needs to conserve it. When that distinction isn't respected, fat loss efforts feel like pushing against a locked door. More force doesn't open it, it just wears you down. This is the turning point in the conversation because it shifts the goal from forcing a deficit to restoring responsiveness. Fat loss doesn't stall because your body forgot how to burn fat. It stalls because the environment that you've created doesn't signal that it's safe to do so. Once you understand that, the strategy changes naturally. You stop trying to overpower the system, and that's where real progress begins. This is the point where most people expect to hear that calories don't matter anymore, and that's not what's coming. Calories still matter, but the role they play after 50 is fundamentally different than what you were taught. The problem isn't that calorie restriction stopped working because the math is wrong. The problem is that the math is being applied to a system that is no longer optimized for aggressive reduction. When you continue to treat calories as the primary lever without accounting for the state of the system receiving them, fat loss efforts often backfire in ways that feel deeply confusing. Earlier in life, calorie reduction functioned like a clean signal. Eat less and the body reliably accessed stored energy. The system interpreted that reduction as a temporary adjustment, not a threat. After 50, the same reduction is often interpreted very differently. Instead of hearing, we're trimming excess, the body hears, resources are shrinking. When that message is layered onto an already taxed nervous system, the response isn't fat loss, it's conservation. The body becomes more efficient, not more generous. It lowers output before it ever touches stored fat on the body. This is why so many people report that eating less now makes them feel worse, not leaner. Energy drops faster than weight. Focus suffers. Sleep becomes lighter or more fragmented. Hunger signals get louder and more urgent. Movement feels heavier. These aren't signs that the approach is almost working. They're signs that the system is under pressure. And when pressure stays high for too long, the body adapts in ways that actively resist fat loss. What's happening underneath the surface is a recalibration of priorities. The body after 50 is less willing to sacrifice stability for appearance. Muscle becomes more precious. Blood sugar regulation becomes more guarded. Stress hormones become more influential. When calories are pulled without adequate support, the body doesn't politely comply anymore. It compensates. It reduces non-essential output. It tightens energy availability. It holds on to fat, not because it's stubborn, but because it's protective. This is where the common advice to just eat less becomes not only ineffective, but counterproductive. A small reduction that once felt measurable can now tip the system into a defensive posture. That posture doesn't always show up as immediate weight gain. Sometimes it shows up as stagnation. Sometimes it shows up as exhaustion. Sometimes it shows up as an endless cycle of starting, stopping, and restarting because the cost feels too high. Over time, this erodes trust with yourself. You start to feel like your body is unpredictable or uncooperative, when in reality, it's responding very consistently to the signals it's receiving. The most important shift here is understanding that fat loss after 50 is not unlocked by creating a bigger deficit. It's unlocked by creating the right conditions for a deficit to be tolerated. When the body feels supported, nourished, and recovered, it can access stored energy without triggering alarm bells. When those conditions are missing, even modest calorie reduction can feel like too much. This isn't failure of willpower, it's a mismatch between strategy and psychology. This is why chasing lower numbers often produces diminishing returns at this stage in our lives. The harder we push, the less responsive the system becomes. Fat loss doesn't accelerate, it slows, and the emotional toll increases alongside the physical one. People start blaming themselves for a problem that was never about effort to begin with. They start assuming that they need to be stricter, more controlled, more disciplined, and what their body is actually asking for is just regulation. This matters because it dismantles the idea that success comes from doing more of what used to work. After 50, fat loss improves when the body feels safe enough to let go, not when it feels cornered. Calories still matter, but they can't be treated as the first move anymore. They become a secondary tool, applied only after the system is stable enough to respond. Once that distinction is clear, the path forward stops feeling like a constant battle and starts feeling strategic again. Once you stop treating calories as the opening move, the entire strategy shifts. This is where fat loss after 50 begins to look completely different from what most people expect. because the focus moves away from reduction and towards restoration. Not restoration in a passive sense and not as an excuse to ignore the results, but restoration of the conditions that allow the body to respond at all. This is the part that feels counterintuitive, especially for people who have spent a lifetime equating progress with doing more and eating less. After 50, the body doesn't respond to pressure. It responds best to clarity. It needs clear signals that resources are available, that recovery is possible, and that stress is not constantly outweighing support. When those signals are present, fat loss becomes a byproduct instead of a battle. When they're missing, even perfectly executed plans struggle to gain traction. This is why so many people feel like they're following the rules and still getting nowhere. The old rules were never designed for this stage of our lives. The new strategy starts with regulation, not restriction. Regulation of blood sugar, nervous system load, sleep quality, and recovery rhythms. When those elements stabilize, the body becomes more willing to access stored energy or fat on the body because it no longer feels like it's operating on the edge. This doesn't mean eating endlessly or abandoning structure. It means fueling in a way that reduces internal stress rather than adding to it. It means respecting hunger cues without chasing them into chaos. It means prioritizing consistency over intensity. This is also where muscle and metabolism quietly take center stage. After 50, muscle isn't just about strength or aesthetics. It's about metabolic communication. Muscle tissues help signal safety, abundance, and resilience. When it's adequately supported, the body feels less urgent to conserve energy. When it's underfueled or chronically stressed, the opposite happens. Fat loss becomes harder, not because fat is the problem, but because the system protecting muscle has gone into overdrive. What surprises many women is that this approach often feels easier, not harder. Energy improves before weight changes. Sleep deepens. Cravings soften. Mood stabilizes. These aren't side benefits. They're signals that the system is becoming responsive again. Fat loss doesn't happen in spite of those changes. It happens because of them. This is why women who shift strategies often say that it feels like their body finally started cooperating again, even though they're no longer pushing the way that they used to. This is the strategic reframe most women never get. Fat loss after 50 isn't about finding the perfect plan or the tightest deficit. It's about sequencing. You don't earn the right to reduce by proving your discipline. You earn it by creating enough stability that reduction is no longer interpreted as a threat. When that order is reversed, progress feels fragile and temporary. When it's respected, results tend to be steadier and far more sustainable. The goal is no longer to see how little you can eat while still functioning. The goal is to support the body well enough that fat loss becomes a natural outcome rather than a forced one. And once that foundation is in place, the conversation about calorie changes again, not as a blunt instrument, but as a precise, intentional tool. By the time people reach this stage of the conversation, something subtle but important has usually shifted. The urgency to fix themselves starts to soften, not because they've given up on the results, but because they finally understand that the struggle was never about a lack of discipline. It was about trying to apply an old identity to a body that had evolved. For decades, success may have meant being the person who could push through anything, who could eat less, do more, and power their way to the outcome. After 50, that identity often becomes the very thing standing in the way of progress. This is where fat loss becomes less about control and more about trust. Trusting that your body isn't lazy or broken. Trusting that resistance is information, not defiance. trusting that support is not the opposite of discipline, but a more sophisticated form of it. That shift can feel uncomfortable at first, especially for women who pride themselves on consistency and strength. Letting go of the need to force results can feel like losing ground, even when it's actually how you regain it. What changes here is the relationship with effort. Effort doesn't disappear, but it becomes smarter. Instead of asking how much more can you tolerate, the question becomes how well your system is supported. Instead of measuring success by how little you eat or how hard you push, success starts to look like stable energy, clear hunger signals, and a body that responds predictably again. Those markers matter because they tell you that your system is no longer in defense mode. This is the identity shift that makes everything else work. You stop seeing fat loss as something that you have to extract from the body through pressure and start seeing it as something your body will allow when it feels safe to do so. That reframing alone reduces stress, and stress reduction is not a soft concept at this stage of life. It's a physiological requirement. Without it, no strategy, no matter how perfectly executed, can deliver lasting results. For many women, this is also the moment that they realize that the goal was never just to lose weight. The deeper goal was to feel capable, energetic, and at ease in their body again. Fat loss becomes one expression of that, not the sole measurement of a success. When the focus widens, the process becomes more sustainable and the results tend to follow in a way that doesn't require constant vigilance or sacrifice. This is why fat loss after 50 truly requires a different strategy. Not because you've lost something, but because you've gained experience, awareness, and a body that responds to care more than coercion. When you stop trying to out-discipline your physiology and start working with it, the fight ends. Progress stops feeling fragile, and fat loss becomes something that happens alongside a better relationship with your body, not at the expense of it. I hope this helped you gain some clarity on where you are in this new stage of your life. And I would love to have you drop a comment and let me know how you've been experiencing this. And as always, be good to yourself, be good to others, and keep loving life over 50.